Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. So for the last couple of weeks, we have been watching the media coverage of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, which has been coupled this summer and fall with the big debate over President Biden's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, ending our 20-year commitment there. What was the last thing you did for 20 years only to admit it was a bad idea?
I don't know. I guess I just have to point to like horrible lack of sleep. What about you?
I mean, you didn't sleep for 20 years?
No
wonder you have a problem getting these scripts done on time.
Hey! And what about you? Tell me about your 20-year mistake.
Actually, you always turn your scripts on time. That was a totally unfair shot. My kids would be furious with me if I said that to them. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about these anniversaries, which I keep putting air quotes around because I think it's a weird thing to have an anniversary for, is that the 9/11 era completely brackets my working career as a writer. As I've said before, like I was doing my book tour when 9/11 happened. I was actually in New York and had done a reading the night before. So writing is something I worked on for that time for 20 years, but I like the novels and nonfiction that I wrote during that time. And we started this podcast, so I don't think those were bad ideas. My wife and I had our first son in 2005, and that was a good idea. I don't know. I mean, I've definitely failed at writing a novel for years at a time, but I've never had to totally bail on a 20-year commitment. So maybe I'm lucky.
I don't know. I mean, calling what we were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq a commitment really seems like a misnomer.
Oh, yeah, well, that's true. I have some other ideas for what to call it, which maybe we'll get to.
I'm just going for straight idiocy.
Okay, yeah. Bloodthirsty madness. Would that be too strong? Or, if you don't like that, how about feckless adventurism or History Channel colonialism?
I think it's more of like a Nickelodeon channel colonialism.
Oh, man. All right. I'm sorry. I was thinking some SpongeBob SquarePants jokes there, and none of them should be made. So I'm just gonna step right past them. What we do want to do is talk specifically about the ways American, Afghan, and Iraqi writers and filmmakers have covered the wars that America started after 9/11. And that's what this episode's about. And this episode is called Bullshit Saviors. Later in the episode, we'll talk to Nadia Hashimi, the author of the novel Sparks Like Stars.
But first, we're going to talk to Helen Benedict. Helen is the author of 7 novels, 5 books of nonfiction, a play, and a forthcoming 8th novel, The Good Deed, about war refugees trapped in Greece. Her 2017 novel Wolf Season received a starred review in Library Journal, and her novel Sand Queen was named a Best Contemporary War Novel by Publishers Weekly. As a nonfiction writer, Benedict's coverage of sexual assault in the US military inspired the Academy Award-nominated documentary The Invisible War and instigated a landmark lawsuit against the Pentagon on behalf of victims of military sexual assault. She is a recipient of the Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism and the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You have always been a writer and a novelist, but you weren't always a writer about America's post-9/11 wars. Your first novel, published in 1990, was about a British teenager living in Brighton in 1975, slightly different topic matter. But since America invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, you've published 2 novels on the effects of those wars in this groundbreaking study about sexual harassment that in the military that Sugi was just mentioned. What drew you to this topic?
Well, initially, the invasion of Iraq. I was just horrified by it because it was very apparent to me, as it was to many, but not enough, that we were in the wrong country, that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 and had nothing to do with revenge. And we were causing a great deal of misery and death, both among Iraqis and ourselves, for no reason. And like many, I was just so horrified by this that I felt that, what can I do about it? And I'm a writer, so what am I going to do about it? I'm going to write about it. But what was I going to write? And then so I did some research and quickly found out that more women were serving in that war with the military than in any American war in history. But nobody had recognized this fact at the time, and nobody was writing about women soldiers except in the most stereotypical way. So that's what got me started on interviewing women veterans who'd just come back from Iraq, some from Afghanistan, back in 2006 and 2007 when I began my work. And those are the stories that led me to discover the horrific epidemic of sexual assault and harassment that was going on at the same time it was going on, even in war, while these women were risking their lives and limbs and mental health in war. But at the whole time, I was also very concerned about what was happening to Iraqi civilians, because we Americans tend to forget about that side of things very often and write about ourselves instead. And I didn't want to be one of those writers. So I went on to find Iraqi refugees and interview them and follow up with my novels, Sand Queen and Wolf Season, where I have a major protagonist who's an Iraqi.
I mean, that was interesting. We know each other in part because my novel, The Good Lieutenant, has a female protagonist. And so I was always interested in other people who had done that same, I had that same moment as you, like, oh my God, there's a lot of women serving in this war and they're effectively on the front lines, even though that technical designation didn't come until much later.
Right.
So, I mean, you know, that was partly my way in as well. And Sugi, when we were doing research for this, I saw you on a list of contemporary conflict writers. How did you come to write? You didn't write about this war, but you did write about war, do write about war. How did you come to be interested in that subject?
I write primarily about the Sri Lankan Civil War and also its effects in diaspora, which I think I'm interested in, of course, primarily because of my family. And then as a result, have, of course, I mean, in looking at other conflicts, have seen such interesting parallels. And then I think also, I don't know, I think a lot about, there's a Camilla Shamsi essay from Guernica several years ago, which I think I've probably referenced on the show before even. And that essay sort of called attention to American writers' failure to write critically about American imperialism. So it is something that I think sort of since that essay, which came out maybe after my first novel came out, that I've thought a lot about. But I think, yeah, my position in this is somewhat different. I'm also reminded, as we're talking about the great memoir Unbecoming, which I reviewed for the New York Times, and we had Anuradha Bhagwati on the show. And some of my familiarity and interest in this topic, specifically sexual assault in the military, also comes from reading Anuradha's book, which I think was really so interesting. And so kind of, I think, you know, as you research your own stuff, you inevitably find yourself going down little internet wormholes to other destinations that don't directly connect to the book. And like, you're kind of like, I'm interested in this, so I'm going to justify just continuing to read. Whereas really, I mean, perhaps I should finish my book. But yeah, I think,
so it's interestingly, it's your past that was the thing there, right? Your family's past and their nationality in a way, right? That war's in the past, right? I'm just saying that's interesting because this war that happened, you know, that was a thing that occurred that I didn't know. It wasn't part of my life up until when it happened. My main reaction to the war when we invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq, I had the same reaction as Helen, which was to be terrified of it, because I had a friend who fought in the Gulf War in 1991, who later had problems, I think, with PTSD and committed suicide. And so my awareness of how dangerous this was going to be felt very different than the culture at large when it was happening, if that makes sense.
I think my own awareness of the Gulf War, and Helen, I'm curious to hear you talk about this as well. I mean, I was a kid. I remember being in the 5th grade, and I had one classmate whose father was in the military, and he came in and spoke to us about the war. And I knew no one else who had any kind of real, what I can refer to perhaps as direct involvement. And so I think I was really very much insulated from the way that that the country at large talked about and thought about that war. And then I think when we went to Afghanistan, I think I wasn't really that politicized. And I don't know, I kind of wish I could go back and have a stronger reaction and sort of go to the streets with many of my friends who did, to say no. And I think by the time we were going to Iraq, I had a reaction I can now more logically defend. But yeah, Helen, what is, when you think back to these earlier wars and you're thinking about America's role in them, there's this succession of other conflicts that lead us in this.
I think that, well, I would say the first thing that awoke me to the problem with war was being, as you can hear, I'm British, I'm not American. But I did spend some of my teenage years in the States, and I was in Berkeley High School, public high school, and I was watching my friends get drafted to Vietnam. And I was on the streets demonstrating against that war. I was on the streets demonstrating against the first Gulf War. But it's not that I was afraid for American soldiers. I could not so much. I couldn't bear the injustice of it. I still can't bear it. I couldn't bear the wrongheadedness of it. And I couldn't bear the glamorization of war that we do over and over again. And I will say during 9/11, I wasn't living in America. I was living in France. And the perspective, there was a huge outpouring of sympathy for all the people who were killed in the towers and the other attacks. But there was not a huge outpouring of warmongering. And being in that atmosphere where people did not have the instant reaction of this is war, this is revenge, and then watching Bush on television on CNN and hearing the soundtrack that CNN would play while he spoke, which is was like the soundtrack of a war movie, the instant reaction of this is war absolutely appalled me. And I just needed to push back as much as I could. So it was very much a reaction against imperialism and the lies. We were being just bombarded with lies. And it wasn't very hard to know that, in my view, because I was just an ordinary person doing research. And I knew that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were enemies. And there was no way they would help each other, that Saddam would have anything to do with it. I mean, it was just, I wasn't a fan of Saddam. I don't want to be misunderstood. But the combination of the lies, the glamorization, the macho posturing of this country, it drove me nuts. And then when I started to think about who would actually pay for it, I just had to do something.
I mean, that was the other thing. You're right to mention that all that glamorization, and of course the in the Gulf War, a tremendous number of Iraqis were killed, even if they had invaded Kuwait. Like, you know, one of the reasons that my friend, I think, had that sort of moral injury was that he, you know, you're involved in killing a lot of people. It's a terrible thing to do. And that was a glamorized thing at the time. The Gulf War was this huge, wonderful, like a Disney ride of a war or something like that. But if you look at actually what occurred, it was tragic and horrific kind of slaughter. And then to go back and then there also, I feel like there also had been a buildup toward that over those years in the 90s that wasn't about the towers. That was about a glamorization of the Greatest Generation and all these World War II films and all this sort of getting away from the critique of war that happened in Vietnam War films, right, where war was a bad thing, and starting to re-glamorize war, and it was exciting again, and people wanted to have a war in 2003. I think it's hard to forget that. I mean, it's important not to forget that.
Yeah. When I started interviewing women who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, I really came to understand that the thing that causes the greatest moral injury is how you hurt other people more than how you were even hurt. But on top of it all, for so many women, they had a double trauma because they were also being persecuted by their own comrades. That's why my book is called The Lonely Soldier, because they were denied that camaraderie, that famous camaraderie that keeps soldiers and Marines and so on going. You know, the brotherhood that so many movies have made about and so many books have been read. And a lot of women never get that. Instead, they're treated as pariahs. So that adds to it. And I have plenty of sympathy about that. But nonetheless, I kept feeling Why aren't we paying attention to what we're doing to Iraqis, what we're doing to Afghan civilians? Just like it took so long to pay attention to what we did to Vietnamese civilians. It took decades.
So I want to ask, of course, all of us being conflict writers in one way or another, be curious to hear what you think of President Biden's decision to remove US troops from Afghanistan after this long period of time.
Well, it wasn't entirely his decision, was it? Remember, who made the original bargain was Trump. Sure. And I think we've got to be very careful not to fall into the right-wing trope of blaming it all on him. Bush invaded without an exit plan. Obama was responsible for the surge, which in some ways was good, in other ways perhaps not. I think, you know what the original sin here? The two original sins. One is the American arrogance, the assumption that everybody in the world wants to be like us and all we have to do is go in there and force it on them and they'll be happy. The other is that the ignorance. You know, we went into both Afghanistan and Iraq without knowing anything about their culture, their history, their language, their desires, and not willing to listen or learn. And I might say, I mean, look, I think we couldn't stay there forever. I don't think it was a terrible decision to leave. We can't have forever wars. It probably could have been done a lot better. I'm more worried about the failure of our intelligence forces and why they didn't know what was going to happen better. Because, I mean, I've been interviewing Afghan refugees for a few years now. And it's well known, if you read anything about it, that the Taliban was already in control of the fifth of the country. They were in control of most of the rural areas. They were already stopping women and girls from going to school. They were already beating up lawyers and teachers in the street. They were already behaving the way they'd always behaved and the way they're behaving now. So why there was all this surprise about, oh my goodness, the Taliban took over so fast and oh no, they're not keeping their promises about being better. I don't get that. I don't get that on the part of the intelligence community, our politicians, or the media, the reporters who kept reporting that without questioning it. A lot of them did question it, but those who didn't. So I think there's been a terrible revelation of US ignorance over all this.
That is no doubt true. I personally think he made the right decision, and I think he's actually going to be a decision that he will be like, I don't want to say like get complimented for, but I think it will in the end look like the right decision. And I think that the media frenzy, and I'll be interested in Sugi and what Sugi and Helen think about this, the media frenzy over that his bad execution of the pullout and that suicide bombing on August 26th, in which 13 American service members were killed. And according to the AP, at least 95 Afghans were killed and more than 100 wounded. You know, like that for about 2 weeks. And we're past that now. I mean, we're in mid-September. That was a huge thing that all the right wing could talk about. That's gone. I don't hear people talking about that right now. I think that it was terrible, but think about how many Afghans were dying during the war. I mean, they were being killed by the Taliban because they were supposedly fighting the Taliban all the time by the tens of thousands, you know, in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, on a yearly basis, right? So ending that war is going to end up probably saving more lives than not. And it was obviously the right thing to do, to me, given that we weren't doing anything useful there and we didn't have any business running that country.
Right. I think we just said the same thing.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah,
I'm saying it will end up redounding to Biden's favor that he made this decision.
Also, let's not perpetuate another myth, which is that that the Americans were such a great presence. We also brutalized people.
Oh, it was terrible.
We also committed war crimes while over there. Not everybody, but we did. And, I've also talked to enough Afghans and Iraqis who are not particularly happy at all about the way they were treated every time they ran across a US, military person. So, again, a lot of cultural mistakes too, a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of clumsiness, and a lot of violence.
We're going to talk about this a little bit at the end, but
yeah.
I do think it's really important to not forget that while there were perfect and wonderfully nice soldiers, there were a lot of soldiers over there who wanted to kill people.
Yeah.
And who wanted specifically to kill people from the Middle East, guys that I saw and was with, right?
Yeah.
I brought this shirt. I bought this in Mosul the last time I was in Iraq in 2010. Here's what it's got: it's got the Statue of Liberty giving you the finger.
Yeah.
And it says, "We're coming, motherfuckers." Mosul, Iraq. I'm showing it on the video. You're not gonna be able to see it. I saved that shirt because it was just chilled the living fuck out of me when I saw it. It was being sold by an Iraqi vendor to soldiers on the base there, right? But you have to remember that was a significant portion of people who were fighting that war felt exactly like that t-shirt, not like the perfect nice soldier that we imagine and think about. You know, I saw it. I know that it was true.
And I also know, I remember interviewing one young woman who went there because she thought, with the army, she thought she was going to help build schools and, you know, and save women. I mean, that was another huge misunderstanding, because women in Iraq actually had a lot of rights before we messed it up, and were going to work and school just fine. It wasn't Afghanistan. But then she was out on a convoy with her colleagues, with her comrades, and a kid threw a stone. They didn't know what it was, threw a stone and hit her friend. And she had this urge to shoot the kid. And it really shocked her. She had been a daycare teacher before she joined the military. And then she realized something about herself. She realized that being in war had made her the kind of person who'd be willing to kill to save a comrade. And as she told me that, she was shaking all over because she was so appalled at herself and how the war had changed her like that. So that happens too. War itself turns people into killers. And of course, the military trains you to be a killer. So it's a long road. They're all pointing in the same way.
And I think I'll be really interested to see how, when we've left Afghanistan, and so the war is technically over, and yet we will, for decades, of course, have the veterans of these wars with us, feeling these effects. And then, of course, also, as you rightly pointed out, the civilians who were affected by these invasions, dispersed around the world or in much worse circumstances in their home countries. And I'm going to be curious to see how successive American administrations, agencies, et cetera, like, how will we account for the war crimes that I think you're rightfully pointing to? I mean, you know, it was just in the news that, you know, at the end of last month, there was a drone strike that killed 10 civilians in Afghanistan and as many as 7 children. I mean, this is horrific.
And so we got to end the whole thing with a war crime. That was our final. I mean, so Biden, you know, does this thing that I approve of, and then, like, just so you know, I'm a killer too, just like all the other American presidents. I'm going to commit a war crime at the end. And
so I think, you know, I'd like to think that, you know, our presence in Afghanistan is rightfully drawn to a close, but then the presence of that conflict with us, you know, how will we account for it? What mechanisms of justice will people be able to pursue? For so long, we've had international mechanisms of justice that basically exclude Americans. American exceptionalism means that, you know, who that family wants to be, they want to be resettled, I understand. So how are we going to account for what we owe? I mean, we can't make this right, but what can we do at all? Which I think is going to be a question for decades and decades.
Yes. And not only, I mean, especially for us, of course, but also for other countries. And meanwhile, you know, most of the countries in Europe are busy throwing up barriers to stop Afghan refugees coming. Greece has just done that, and several other. They don't want them. Nobody wants them. So, you know, what do we owe? What do we owe the Afghan people, and how can we pay them back? How can we help? I think that's the question we need to keep asking. And war isn't the answer, but nor is abandoning them entirely, especially women and girls.
I agree, Helen. My neighbor across the street was a boat person whose husband had been killed in Vietnam and came here in the 70s, right? And so all the Vietnamese refugees who came here have been a tremendous addition to American culture and have been like wonderful citizens. And it's wonderful to have them in the country. I feel the same way about the Afghans, but I expect that the greeting will not be as nice as I would prefer for it to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you're talking, and I want to also say, like, I met many soldiers who were extremely idealistic and who did wonderful things and were very patient and were not, were fair-minded about the people that they were trying to help and didn't want to kill them, right? So I want to say there's a balance of people there. There's both things. Of
course.
But your novel, Wolf Season, deals with that exact sort of trauma and the way that it affects a young woman, an Iraq War veteran. I wondered, and her encounter with an Iraqi doctor, Naima Jassim. Could you talk to us about the inspiration for that book, and then maybe set it up and read to us?
Yeah, the inspiration came from a little news item I read somewhere, where I read about an Iraq War veteran who had brought home to America, sponsored his Iraqi interpreter and his Iraqi family, and brought them to his home because the interpreter was being given, he was being threatened with being killed for having worked for Americans. And his wife said to the veteran, "It's them or us. I can't live with these people. It's them or me." And he chose them. So she left. And this was a little news item. And I thought the drama in that he chose his terp as military talk for an interpreter over his wife is so interesting. And that's what actually triggered the whole idea for this book. But eventually, and then also because I was so interested in the Iraqi side, as I mentioned before, and had begun to interview Iraqi refugees. There are quite a lot of them who had been settled in Albany, near where I live part-time, Albany, New York. But I got fascinated with the idea of going back and forth between an Iraqi point of view and an American point of view. So I did that in Sand Queen, which was the first novel about this subject, which was set in Iraq. And then I thought, let's follow Naima when she's already a refugee and she's become a doctor. She was a medical student in Iraq. And meanwhile, there's this woman with a daughter, and the woman, Rin, is really traumatized by the way she was treated she was raped by her fellow soldiers in Iraq, as well as just war. And what happens when the two of them are brought together in this pediatrics clinic. So I should mention too that Rin's daughter was born blind. She was conceived in Iraq. She was born blind. And Rin thinks it's because at one point in an explosion, she was covered with depleted uranium, which happens to a lot of people and can cause birth defects. So that's the setup for that sort of how the novel came about with those ideas. She also I met a veteran who lives with her child in the forest with 3 pet wolves. And that was a real person in a different state than I give to Rin, but Rin has pet wolves, which is not unusual among veterans, I discovered, and that was a fascinating thing too.
So can you go ahead and read that passage?
Sure. So Rin and her daughter have just arrived at a pediatrics clinic, which is for the children of veterans, and for a checkup for Junie, who's 9 years old, and as I said, blind. But meanwhile, there's a hurricane whipping up, and they're not really quite aware of it yet. So I'll just begin shortly after they arrive in the clinic. The wind rampages through woods and parking lots, streets and gardens, seizing sumacs, maples, and willows and shaking them until their boughs drop like shot geese. Up the hill, the rain-bloated creek presses its new weight against the crumbling dam, pushing and pounding until with a great roar, it bursts through, leaps its banks, and rushes headlong down the slope toward the clinic, a foaming wall of red mud, branches, and rocks, flattening every shrub and tree in its path. Inside the clinic, the air conditioning hums, voices murmur, babies whimper. Wendy Fitch, the nurse, hovers by the door of the examining room, checking her watch. Dr. Jassim might be great with her patients, but the woman has 0 sense of time. Whether this has something to do with her culture or is only an individual quirk, Wendy doesn't know. But the doctor needs to finish up here and fetch her son from his friend's house, the boys' summer baseball camp having sensibly closed against the impending storm. The rain is beating on the windows now, and Wendy can feel the patient's parents growing more restless by the minute, as eager as she is to get back to their canned food and bottled water, their batteries and candles. Her pulse quickens. As a lowly nurse, she has to bear the brunt of the parents' ire, and these are no ordinary parents either. They are all military veterans, half of them ramped up or angry, like that pit bull of a woman, Ryn Drummond. We better hurry, storm's coming on quick, Wendy says, when Naima emerges at last from the first examining room. Watch out for this one, she adds in a whisper, touching her temple. Room 3. Naima nods with a resigned smile and walks towards the door. Ryn can't believe they gave Junie an Arab for a doctor. Typical of the VA to hire the second rate. The woman probably bought a certificate online, did her training on YouTube, probably blew up some sucker of a soldier or two on her way here as well. Mommy, what's wrong? Ryn takes a breath and another. It's okay, it's just this place. She strokes her daughter's hair and pulls her close once more, feeling her frail body shiver. A knock on the door, gentle, yet it sends a spasm through Ryn's every nerve. The door opens and in walks a woman in a white coat, as if she's a real doctor. No headscarf, at least, but there's that familiar olive brown skin and blue-black hair. She's carrying a clipboard file, which she reads before even saying hello, which Ryn considers damn rude. Then she looks up. A splattered white scar on her right cheekbone, most likely a shrapnel wound. Ryn would know, having some 15 herself. Good morning, the doctor says to Junie, voice snake oil smooth, accent not much more than the lilt, but oh so recognizable. You are June, right? But Junie isn't listening. Her head's up, cocked at an angle that means her mind is elsewhere. Mommy? Ryn is shaking, the face, the scar. Her breathing is coming short and airless. Mommy! Junie's voice is more urgent now. I hear something. There is no need to be frightened, dear, the doctor says, and Ryn can't tell whether she's talking to Junie or her. Mommy! Junie jumps down from the examining table, her robe falling off, leaving her in nothing but white cotton underpants, skin and bone. Something bad's happening. Get out of here, Ryn yells at the doctor. What is the matter? The doctor looks confused. No, not her, Junie cries. Run! And she hurls herself into the dangerous air, unable to see the metal table covered with glass bottles and needles, the jutting chair legs on the floor. Ryn reaches out and catches her, but she wriggles free in true terror. Let us out, she screams, because at that moment the window bursts open and a torrent of red water crashes through, smashing them against the wall, knocking them over, pounding them with a wall of mud and branches and shattered glass. Ryn's soldier training, her wolf heart, these are not in her blood for nothing. She struggles to her feet, seizes Junie around the waist, and forces the door open, kicking away the flailing doctor, tangled in her white coat, her long hair, her scar, and her legacy. Ryn slams her face down in the water and steps on her, using her body to lever her daughter through the door and out of the water to safety.
Thank you so much. I'm just totally transported by that passage. Am I wrong to think that Ryn and Naima are two characters who have been harmed and disregarded by their respective cultures in similar ways?
Yes, no, not wrong, but not entirely similar ways. Because Naima was doing fine in her culture until war came along. It's war that's knocked her life askew, killed her husband, and taken the leg of her child, who you didn't meet in this passage. So, but she's not a victim of sexual assault. She came from an upper middle class family. She was in medical school when she was going to be a doctor when the war started. She was fine. But Rin, working class, really went to war because she didn't know what else to do with her life and couldn't find a future, which is so true for so many people. And then was betrayed by her own comrades and also lost her husband in the war. He was killed in Iraq. So when she was a new widow, she was attacked by his friends and raped by them. So the betrayal is very deep, which is why she's so screwed up, and she's blaming Naima, when not her fault at all, which is why this passage is so harsh. And but they both, things develop, and Rin learns. She learns to get out of that frame of mind eventually. But yeah, so they both suffered, but in different ways, I would say.
So I'm going to note this and then I think I want us to move on to talking about the general way that people have written about these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001. But a lot of talk has been given lip service, maybe sometimes serious, about the dangers that women in Afghanistan are going to face now that American troops are going to leave, supposedly, and the women, well, not supposedly, are leaving, and women will be discriminated against by the Taliban. But it is ironic to me, given that you have written about sexual assault in military culture, that that is not discussed in the same way, right? And I just find that something to note, right? If you want to comment on that, Helen, that's fine. I'll give you some space.
Sure. I mean, women are discriminated and degraded and attacked and assaulted and beaten up and raped all over the world. Forced marriage, it's a worldwide problem. I wouldn't ever go so far as to saying what American women face in the military is the same as what women face under the Taliban. But sexism is sexism, misogyny is misogyny, and disrespect for women as human beings is the same. It's how it's manifested that's different. Why we don't, you make a very good point though, Whitney, because I've noticed this. We are so much more willing to talk about how badly treated women are treated in other countries. If you remember a few years back, there was this rash of really brutal, violent rapes and murders in India that we were giving a lot of press to. And there were all these articles analyzing, the misogyny of Indian culture and how it led to men thinking they could treat women like this and all that. We never turn that spotlight on ourselves. We never cover the story of, why do men rape women? Why do men constantly beat up women?
And I think that this has so much to do with also sort of the grand, and I'm referring specifically, I suppose, to American, Western, and Eurocentric depictions of war, right? The colonizer, the occupier, the savior, the rescuer, who's coming in to save, right, the damsel in distress so much of the time. So I'm curious to kind of just broaden out from this a little bit.
Which is why you decided to call this episode "Bullshit Saviors," which is a fine title.
I think that was you, but
was it me? I thought it was you.
Great. Good title.
But I think, from a bird's eye perspective, present company excluded, I'm curious to hear your take, Helen, on how American writers and filmmakers have done at describing our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, I hate to make generalizations, but let me talk about movies first. But this is true. I mean, there are real exceptions to what I'm about to say, thank God. But we do have a propensity to glamorize war and to glamorize soldiers and to turn them into, big muscular heroes running around with big muscular guns. And we do tend to cover, to portray the civilians of other countries in stereotypes. They're either villains or saints. They're very rarely given the full complexity of a human being. And especially Hollywood, and especially the big blockbuster types. We have such a long history in this country of glamorizing war through entertainment. And we keep perpetuating the big lie, you know, that war is exciting and glamorous, whereas in fact it's horrible, usually unjust, and it corrupts the human soul and heart. And there are, thank goodness, writers and filmmakers who go straight for that. But we need more of them, and I wish big Hollywood would do that more and not always make it about the suffering American.
I mean, I totally agree with all of those things and feel like that is really what was a known problem going into this war and has not been solved by a lot of the fiction and movies about this war. I did write a piece once for the New Republic called "What Should a War Movie Do?" And you know, for me, it was Catherine Bigelow, I think, who did The Hurt Locker, which is a movie that I think is terrible. To be perfectly honest, who said, "I'm anti-war, but I'm pro the people forced to engage with it," which is a way of not taking a stand, I think. And she ended up making a movie that made, what is that, Renner? What's his name? The guy who's Hawkeye now in the Marvel films.
Jeremy Renner. Yeah.
Jeremy Renner. Like, of course, he's now Hawkeye in the Marvel films. Like, I mean, that movie could have done so many things, but what it didn't do was the thing it needed to do, which is what Helen said, is not glamorize war. Not make it like a place where you find your true brothers and your true meaning and then walk off the back of a plane at the end to AC/DC playing about what a badass you are. I mean, that is really what that movie did.
Yeah. I want to hear more specific offenders. if you were willing to.
This book, Generation Kill, does anybody remember? This was one of the first books written about Iraq. By Evan Wright. Here's the back copy. I would love to hear Helen and Sugi comment on this. They were called a generation without heroes. They were called upon to be heroes. Within hours of 9/11, America's war on terror fell to those like the Marines of the 1st Recon Battalion, the first generation dispatched into open-ended combat since Vietnam. They were a new breed of warrior, unrecognizable to their forebears, soldiers raised on hip-hop, internet porn, and video games, a disparate band of born-again Christians, dopers, Buddhists, and New Agers who glean their precepts from kung fu movies and Oprah Winfrey. Cocky, brave, headstrong, wary, and mostly unprepared for the physical, emotional, and moral horrors ahead, the 1st Suicide Battalion would spearhead the Blitzkrieg on Iraq. And there's more.
There you go. I mean, you know, it's easy to laugh at it because it seems so over the top, but it's actually really dangerous because this kind of propaganda, with the way this country is, entertainment industry is super macho. What's more macho than a soldier or a Marine, you know? And it just perpetuates the idea that we should be keen on war, that we should be keen on killing, that we should be keen on invading other countries, and we should be keen on torturing people. That's another thing that gets glamorized in these movies we're talking about. And it
24.
persuades young boys, it persuades young boys to join up so they can go off and be macho and kill people too. I think it's very dangerous. And it's also, it's a lie. It's a big, big lie. That's even.
The other part of that lie that I also rebel against is the idea that and many people peddle this, that the one saving grace of being in the army in combat is the wonderful brotherhood that you're going to have with all of your pallies. Right. And that brotherhood does not happen afterwards when you're having PTSD and you're in miserable pain, or you're dealing with the fact that you killed people. I mean, and sometimes people betray each other in war and aren't brothers. I mean, it's not the magic brotherhood thing that it needs to be seen for the cliche that it is, right? People are the same in war as they are as humans. Nobody's the perfect brother. You may have friends, but you could have had those friends without war. You don't need war to have friends. That is an insane concept, right? That is constantly peddled by Hollywood movies and I think many books.
Well, and also it ignores the people who who are not admitted to that brotherhood, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about women. But it includes gays, it often includes people of color, it includes anybody that, you know, the social leaders, like high school. Of course, a lot of them are just out of high school, you know, they're deemed weak or misfits in some way. It drives people commit suicide over this, you know, young young recruits kill themselves sometimes because of the way they're treated by their comrades. What kind of brotherhood is that, and why? And what happened to sisterhood?
I think it's so interesting that, I mean, I feel like I grew up really on narratives of American wrongdoing in Vietnam, American mistakes in Vietnam. I mean, it is in everything from Karate Kid to, and then I remember Casualties of War coming out, and I had been a Michael J. Fox fan, but sort of Family Ties, Alex P. Keaton, Teen Wolf era. And then all of a sudden he's in this Vietnam movie about, which is really about violence perpetrated on Vietnamese civilians. And I think I was sort of like right at the edge of not old enough to watch it, and maybe partway through it actually had to turn it off. But I wonder at what point we're going to start seeing like a real influx in popular and mainstream culture in like a way that becomes part of our American cultural and emotional vocabulary. When will the kind of wrongdoing that we perpetrated in Iraq and Afghanistan enter the culture in that way? I feel like either I'm not seeing those things because I just happen to not be seeing them, or it hasn't happened yet. I wonder what you think.
I think it does exist in novels, and some of literary novels, including the company here. But and there, I don't know if you ever saw The Messenger. My favorite movie about Iraq was Oren Moverman's movie, The Messenger. It was a small, quiet movie. It wasn't even in Iraq. It was about two soldiers whose job was to go from house to house to tell the families that their loved one had been killed. So the families of soldiers or Marines, and had to go and tell them. I can't remember which. So it was all just about dealing with, and again, it was very American oriented, but it was quiet and avoided sentimentality, but it was not glamorizing war because it was about death. And it was really well done. But in terms of kind of the blockbuster type thing, or the big series, big popular Netflix series, I don't know. I mean, I stopped going to see those movies a long time ago because they would make me so angry. I couldn't stand it.
Well, I will recommend two books. One is Ahmed Sadawi's book, Frankenstein in Baghdad.
Which I've read, yeah.
Ahmed, did I say Ahmed? I hope I said that right. Yeah. And then I'm going to just bring one back from Europe for your countryman, or former countryman. Robert Graves' book, Goodbye to All That, is one of the best war memoirs that I've ever read. Most
I love
honest.
that book. Yeah.
I think we need books like that about this war.
And we need, I actually wrote a piece. I wrote an essay for LitHub a few years ago recommending Iraqi books.
We'll link to that.
Unknown, many of them unknown by most Americans, but all available here. And the Frankenstein was on it. That was one of them. And Sinan Antoon's work, I really like too. The Corpse exhibition is another one. But there have been, I like Katie Schultz's work. I like Jessie Goulby's work. I like Kara Hoffman's work. And, there are those of us out here who write about war in order to de-glamorize it and to get to what it actually does to the human heart and soul. I think
our friend Matt Gallagher, who's been on the show a couple times, I would include him in that group.
I would too. And you always leave people out when you make lists.
That's all right. We're not going to put any more people on it because we have to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us, Helen. And before we end, I'd love for you to tell our listeners about what you're working on now.
Sure. Well, I just finished a novel that will be out in a couple of years called The Good Deed. I've spent the last 3 years working on a refugee camp, not really working, but interviewing people there in Greece, and where there are many Syrians as well as Afghans, Iraqis, and refugees from various conflicts in Africa, as well as people who are refugees because they are LGBTQ and they come from one of the 71 countries around the world that illegalizes that, and they would be killed or imprisoned for life if they stayed at home. But they are being treated shamefully by Greece and the EU, much as we are doing to our own refugees on our own borders in this country. And that's what my novel is about in a political sense. But it follows the stories of some Syrian women, a Sudanese woman, and an American tourist who is trying to do a good deed and runs into all the problems with being a white savior.
Well, it sounds great. We will look forward to it. Thank you, Helen, so much for joining us today. And we encourage our listeners to go out and pick up a copy of Wolf Season or any of Helen's previous books, and to keep an eye out for The Good Deed. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.